It was a quiet afternoon at the Sunburst Diner, where truckers and travelers found respite from their long journeys. The air was thick with the aroma of sizzling bacon, and laughter mixed with the chatter of road-worn patrons. At the counter sat George Harrison, a retired Marine veteran and truck driver, savoring his coffee while appreciating the peace that had been rare in his life. George, with his weathered face and calm demeanor, had always been a source of comfort for the regulars. But today, the tranquility was shattered. A loud roar echoed through the parking lot, followed by the rumble of engines. 6 motorcycles pulled in, their riders clad in black leather with snake emblems stitched on their jackets. The Sunburst regulars turned to see who had arrived, and the atmosphere immediately shifted. These men were the Vipers, a notorious biker gang known for their unruly antics and penchant for trouble. At the head of the pack was Roy "Razor" Morrison, a man who exuded intimidation wherever he went. If you're just joining us, make sure to like this video, leave a comment on where you're watching from, and subscribe for more gripping stories. We'd love to know where you're from and hear your thoughts. The Vipers walked in with swagger, their presence alone turning the once friendly chatter into uneasy murmurs. George watched them carefully, his instincts sharper than they appeared. Lisa, the young waitress, approached cautiously, her voice trembling slightly as she greeted them. "What can I get you folks today?" she asked, hoping to defuse any tension. Roy smirked at her, leaning in. "How about your number, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice dripping with arrogance. The gang erupted in laughter. Lisa took a nervous step back, and the laughter only grew louder. That's when George stood up, his movement calm but deliberate, like a lion rising from his rest. He didn't say a word, but his presence alone shifted the energy in the room. Roy turned towards George, a mocking grin still on his face. "Got something to say, old man?" he challenged. George met his eyes, his voice steady. "How about showing some respect?" The bikers chuckled, though some of them exchanged uncertain glances. George's presence was different from others they had bullied. There was something about him that spoke of experience, strength, and unflinching courage. Roy stepped closer to George, trying to use his size to intimidate. "Respect? I don't think you understand where you are," he sneered, his face inches from George's. But George didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The whole diner seemed to hold its breath. "I understand exactly where I am," George said quietly. "And I understand that everyone deserves respect, especially the folks here." He nodded slightly towards Lisa, who was watching with wide eyes. Roy's grin faded slightly. The rest of the bikers shifted uncomfortably. They had expected to dominate, to scare these strangers into submission. But this old man wasn't backing down. Behind George, other truckers began to rise from their seats. First it was Tommy, an old friend of George's, who had driven long-haul routes across the country with him. Then others followed suit, each one silently standing with George. Roy looked around, his smirk faltering. This was not the response he had anticipated. "You think you can stand up to us, Grandpa?" Roy's voice was filled with irritation now. George's eyes narrowed slightly, his voice still calm. "I think you need to leave before things get out of hand." For a moment, it seemed like Roy might throw a punch. He clenched his fists, his eyes locked onto George's. But something in George's unwavering gaze seemed to make him hesitate. The other bikers exchanged uneasy glances. They had come looking for an easy target, but what they found was a wall of resilience they hadn't expected. "This place isn't your playground," George added, his voice carrying weight. "These people are my family, and I won't let you harm them." The diner was utterly silent, the tension almost unbearable. Roy's eyes flicked around the room, and he could see the unwavering resolve of the truckers. There was no fear in their faces, only determination. He realized that if things escalated, he and his gang might not have the upper hand they thought they did. Tommy stepped forward, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "You heard the man," Tommy said, his voice steady. "It's time for you to go." Roy looked back at his crew, hoping to see some confidence, some sign that they still had the intimidation factor. But instead, he saw uncertainty. Even the biggest of them, Duke, was shifting from foot to foot, his gaze avoiding George's. The realization hit Roy like a punch to the gut. They were outnumbered, not in bodies, but in courage. Roy took a step back, his sneer turning into a scowl. "You think this is over?" he spat, trying to regain some of his bravado. "We'll be back." George simply nodded, his eyes never leaving Roy's. "You do what you need to do," he said calmly. "But know this, we'll be ready." The tension broke as Roy turned on his heel, barking at his crew to follow him. One by one, the bikers filed out of the diner, their bravado visibly diminished. The roar of their motorcycles soon filled the air, but it lacked the menace it had when they first arrived. As the door closed behind them, a collective sigh seemed to pass through the diner. The truckers began to sit down, the tension slowly easing. Lisa came over to George, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. George gave her a gentle smile. "No need to thank me, Lisa. We look out for each other here. That's what family does." Tommy clapped George on the shoulder, a grin spreading across his face. "You always did know how to handle the tough ones, George." George chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Just another day, Tommy. Just another day." The warmth slowly returned to the diner, and the patrons resumed their meals, the sense of community stronger than ever. The silence that followed George's words was heavy. Roy took a step back, looking at his gang, hoping to gauge their support. But it was clear that the Vipers were losing their nerve. Tommy and the other truckers, though older, were all men who had seen their share of scrapes and were not about to let anyone terrorize their community. Lisa, still behind the counter, saw the shift too. She moved towards Pete, the manager, and whispered, "Should we call the police?" Pete shook his head, his eyes on George. He trusted the retired Marine more than anyone else in that moment. Roy tried to regain control. "You think this is over?" he said, pointing a finger at George. But his voice lacked the edge it had carried earlier. "You haven't seen the last of us." "Maybe," George replied, his expression still calm. "But you won't find what you're looking for here." He motioned with his head towards the door, and slowly, reluctantly, Roy turned. One by one, the bikers followed him out, their bravado visibly diminished. As they mounted their bikes, Roy shot one last glare at George before revving his engine and speeding away, the others following closely behind. Inside the diner, the tension slowly began to fade. Lisa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The truckers began to sit down, resuming their interrupted meals. George walked back to his seat, his face as composed as ever. Lisa approached him with a fresh cup of coffee. "Thank you," she said quietly, her hands still trembling slightly. George gave her a kind smile. "Just doing what anyone should, dear," he replied. Tommy leaned over from the next table, his voice gruff but filled with admiration. "You handled that just like old times, George." Those fellas didn't know who they were messing with. There was a murmur of agreement from the other truckers, who nodded appreciatively. "It's not about being tough," George said, his eyes meeting Tommy's. "It's about standing up for what's right. They were just bullies, and bullies always back down when they see people united." Pete, the manager, approached cautiously. "George, I don't know how to thank you. You saved us from what could have been real bad." He looked around the diner, the patrons slowly relaxing back into their conversations. George shook his head. "We're all in this together, Pete. You know that. We stick together, and we make it through. That's how it works." Pete nodded, clearly moved. "Well, coffee's on the house for as long as you want it," he said, trying to lighten the mood. George chuckled, raising his cup in a mock toast. "I'll hold you to that, Pete." Lisa watched the scene, her heart swelling with a sense of belonging. She realized that George wasn't just protecting the diner. He was protecting the idea of community, of people looking out for each other no matter what. It was something she hadn't seen much of in her life, and it brought tears to her eyes. The door of the diner opened again, and everyone tensed. But it was just a young couple coming in for a meal. The tension eased, and someone laughed nervously, breaking the ice. Lisa wiped her eyes quickly, composing herself, and moved to greet the new customers. Tommy turned to George once more, his tone dropping to a whisper. "You think they'll be back?" George set his cup down and leaned back, considering the question. "Maybe. Men like Roy don't like being told no." But if they do, we'll be ready. Tommy nodded. You know, not everyone would have stood up like you did today. George gave a small smile. Everyone has it in them. Sometimes, they just need someone to show them how. Outside, the rumble of the motorcycles had faded into nothing, but everyone knew it was likely not the last they would see of the Vipers. Yet the diner felt different now. There was a renewed energy, a sense of solidarity that hadn't been there before. They had faced down something ugly together, and they had come out stronger for it. Pete stepped behind the counter, his hands still a bit shaky as he grabbed a rag to wipe down the spotless counter. You know, he called out to no one in particular. This place might just need a bouncer after all. George raised an eyebrow, a teasing smile forming. You hiring, Pete? The laughter that followed was genuine, the warmth returning to the Sunburst Diner as the patrons settled back into the comfortable rhythm of the afternoon. The threat was gone, at least for now, and the diner was once again filled with the familiar sounds of forks clinking on plates, coffee being poured, and the easy conversations of a community that had each other's backs. And in the middle of it all sat George, the calm at the center of the storm, his eyes watching the door but his heart at peace. He knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, and that made all the difference. The next day, George returned to the Sunburst Diner, just as he always did. The regulars were there, along with Lisa and Pete. It seemed like things were back to normal, but George couldn't shake the feeling that Roy wasn't done yet. He knew men like Roy, men whose pride wouldn't let them back down easily. Sure enough, by late afternoon, the unmistakable rumble of motorcycles could be heard in the distance. The Vipers had returned. George exchanged a look with Tommy, who nodded, his expression grim. The truckers all stood up, ready for what was to come. The bikers dismounted, and this time there were more of them. Roy had brought reinforcements. They pushed open the door with a loud bang, their boots clattering against the floor. Roy looked straight at George. I told you we weren't done, he spat, his eyes filled with fury. George stood from his stool, his calm demeanor unwavering. You should have stayed gone, he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. The truckers formed a line behind George, their expressions resolute. You boys really want to do this? Tommy called out, his voice carrying a warning. Roy's face twisted in anger. You think you can scare us? We're the Vipers. No one stands up to us. George shook his head. No one except us, he replied. And we're not going anywhere. Roy looked around at his crew, trying to find the same confidence he had when he first arrived. But even with the extra numbers, the Vipers looked uncertain. They had come expecting fear, expecting easy targets. Instead, they found a group of people standing together, unflinching. Pete, behind the counter, felt his heart pounding. He glanced at Lisa, who was watching with wide eyes, her hands trembling slightly. She caught his gaze, and he gave her a small nod, trying to reassure her. It'll be okay, he whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. Roy clenched his jaw, his frustration evident. He stepped closer to George, trying to intimidate him. This is your last chance, old man. Move out of our way, or we'll make you. George didn't move an inch. His voice was steady, his eyes locked on Roy's. If you want to go through us, then go ahead and try. But I promise you, it won't end the way you think. The silence that followed was thick with tension. The truckers, still standing behind George, looked ready for anything. Tommy, his face hard, took a step forward. We're not looking for trouble, but we won't let you bully us, he said, his voice steady. Roy's eyes flicked from George to the line of truckers, then back to George. He could see the determination in their faces, the kind of resolve that wouldn't break easily. His hands curled into fists, but he hesitated. The fearlessness of the people before him was something he hadn't expected, something that unsettled him. One of the bikers, a younger man with a nervous look, spoke up. Roy, maybe we should just go. Roy shot him a glare, but the words had already planted doubt in the others. A couple of them shifted uneasily, clearly not eager to escalate things further. George took a small step forward, his gaze never leaving Roy's. You have a choice, Roy. Leave now, and no one gets hurt. Stay, and you'll regret it. Roy stared at George, his face twisted in a mix of anger and frustration. For a long moment, It seemed like he might push forward, might force the confrontation. But then, slowly, he took a step back. He looked at his crew, and with a snarl, he barked, "Let's go." The bikers turned, some of them visibly relieved. They filed out of the diner, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. Roy was the last to leave, pausing at the door to shoot one last look at George. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. George nodded, his expression calm. "We'll be here," he replied. As the door swung shut behind them, the tension in the diner slowly began to ease. The truckers relaxed, and George finally sat back down. Lisa brought over a fresh pot of coffee, her hands still shaking a little. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. George gave her a reassuring smile. "We're all in this together, Lisa. Always." Suddenly, the diner door opened again, but it wasn't more bikers. It was Sheriff Donovan, an old friend of George's, accompanied by 2 deputies. They stepped inside, taking in the scene. Donovan looked at George, then at Roy and his crew. "Is there a problem here?" the sheriff asked, his voice calm but firm. Roy hesitated, his bravado faltering. He had not expected the law to be involved. "No problem, Sheriff," Roy muttered, though his eyes were still filled with resentment. He glanced at George, who stood unmoving, his face expressionless. Sheriff Donovan nodded slowly. "Good to hear," he said, taking a step forward. "Because I don't think anyone wants trouble here, right?" The Vipers exchanged uneasy glances, and one by one, they started backing towards the door. Roy stayed for a moment longer, glaring at George, before finally turning and following his crew out. The roar of their motorcycles soon faded into the distance once more. Sheriff Donovan turned to George and smiled. "Figured you could use a little backup, old friend," he said. George nodded. "Thanks, Donovan. Though I think we had it handled." The sheriff laughed. "I have no doubt about that." Pete let out a long sigh of relief from behind the counter, his shoulders sagging as the tension drained from the room. The other truckers began to sit down, their stances softening now that the threat had passed. Lisa, her hands still trembling, hurried over to George with another fresh pot of coffee. "Thank you, George," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know what we'd do without you." George smiled at her warmly. "It's not just me, Lisa. It's all of us. We stand together, and that's what makes the difference." Donovan watched the exchange, nodding approvingly. "You've got a good community here, George. Not everyone would have the courage to stand up like you all did today." George shrugged modestly. "Just doing what's right. These folks are family." He looked around the diner, his gaze settling on each of the truckers who had stood with him. "And family looks out for each other." The sheriff gave George a pat on the shoulder. "Well, you're a lucky man to have a family like this. And they're lucky to have you." Pete stepped forward, rubbing his hands nervously. "Sheriff, do you think they'll come back? I mean," Roy seemed pretty determined. Sheriff Donovan looked thoughtful for a moment before answering. "Men like Roy usually don't give up easily, but they also know when they're outmatched." He glanced at George and the truckers. "And I'd say they know they are." George nodded, his eyes still sharp, watching the door as if expecting Roy to burst back in at any moment. "If they do come back, we'll be ready," he said firmly. "And we'll handle it together, just like today." Lisa glanced around, her eyes meeting those of the regulars. She could see the determination in their faces, the shared sense of resilience that had grown stronger through the day's events. She realized then that the diner wasn't just a place where people came for a meal. It was a sanctuary, a place where they looked out for one another. "I'll start making some extra coffee," she said with a small smile. "Something tells me we'll need it." The sheriff chuckled, tipping his hat. "That's the spirit, young lady." He turned back to George. "I'll be keeping an eye on things. But you call me if anything else happens, you hear?" George nodded. "Thanks, Donovan. Appreciate you coming by." The sheriff gave a final nod to the room before heading out, his deputies following. As the door closed behind them, the rumble of motorcycles was long gone, replaced by the comforting hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware. Tommy, who had been quiet since the sheriff's arrival, finally spoke up. "You know, George, not every place has someone like you." Someone who's willing to stand up and keep everyone safe. George shook his head. It's not just me, Tommy. It's all of you. Every one of us stood up today, and that's why they backed down. It's not about being the toughest guy in the room. It's about having each other's backs. The truckers nodded in agreement, a sense of pride and unity filling the diner. Lisa looked around, her heart swelling with a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew now, without a doubt, that she was part of something special. This wasn't just a job. It was home. Pete wiped his brow and smiled at George. Well, looks like coffee's on the house for you, George. And for anyone else who stood up today. George laughed softly, raising his coffee cup in a toast. To standing together, he said. The others raised their cups, echoing the sentiment. To standing together. And as the warmth returned to the Sunburst Diner, the fear and tension of moments before seemed like a distant memory. Whatever came next, they knew they would face it as a community, united and unbreakable. With the bikers gone, the Sunburst Diner returned to its usual warmth. The patrons began to relax, laughter slowly filling the room again. Lisa brought over a piece of pie for George, her hands no longer trembling. On the house, she said with a smile, for keeping us all safe. George smiled, taking the plate. Thank you, Lisa. But remember, it's not just me. It's all of us. He gestured towards the truckers, who nodded in agreement. Together, we make this place safe. The sense of community was palpable. The people at the diner that day knew they weren't just a collection of strangers anymore. They were a family, bound together by their courage and unity. Pete, the manager, came over and clapped George on the shoulder. I think we're gonna need to make you a permanent fixture around here, he said, grinning. George chuckled, shaking his head. I think I'll stick to driving, Pete, but I'll always be here when you need me. The sheriff stayed for a while, enjoying a cup of coffee with George and the others. The mood had shifted from tense to triumphant, and it was clear to everyone that Roy and his gang wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. They had faced resistance stronger than they'd imagined, not just from an old Marine, but from an entire community unwilling to be intimidated. As the sheriff finished his coffee, he stood up, tipping his hat to the room. You folks take care now. And George, don't hesitate to call if you need us. George nodded. Thank you, Sheriff. We'll be just fine. As Sheriff Donovan left, the patrons began to settle back into their usual rhythm. The clatter of dishes, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, and the hum of conversation filled the diner once more. Lisa looked around, seeing smiles instead of fear, and felt a deep sense of relief. She walked over to Tommy and poured him another cup of coffee, her own smile growing wider. I think today showed us all something important, she said softly. Tommy looked up, raising an eyebrow. Oh yeah? And what's that, Lisa? That we're stronger together than any of us are alone, she replied, her voice full of conviction. No matter what comes, we've got each other. Tommy nodded, his eyes softening. You're right, Lisa. We sure do. George watched the exchange, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He had seen battlefields, faced enemies, and survived hardships. But today, standing with these people, he felt a different kind of victory, one that was sweeter than any he'd experienced before. It was the victory of knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family. The Sunburst Diner might have just been a small roadside stop, but to everyone inside, it was much more than that. It was a beacon of hope, a place of belonging, and, most importantly, a symbol of their unbreakable unity. As the sun began to set, the Sunburst Diner settled into a comfortable quiet. George finished his pie, tipping his hat to Lisa as he stood up to leave. You take care now, Lisa, he said. And remember, if those boys ever come back, you know what to do. Lisa nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. I know, George. And we'll be ready. George stepped out into the cool evening air, his eyes scanning the horizon. The Vipers might come back one day, but he knew that together, the people of the Sunburst Diner would be ready. They had each other, and that was more powerful than any gang of bikers. The sound of the doorbell chimed behind him as Tommy and the other truckers stepped out, joining George as they headed to their rigs. Where to next, George? Tommy asked, his voice filled with the easy camaraderie that only years of friendship could bring. George smiled, looking out at the open road. Wherever the road takes us, my friend. Wherever the road takes us. And with that, they climbed into their trucks, engines roaring to life, and drove off into the setting sun. Ready for whatever lay ahead, confident that they had each other's backs. Back inside, Lisa and Pete began cleaning up, the diner slowly winding down for the night. Lisa looked around, seeing the familiar faces of the patrons who had stood together against the Vipers. It wasn't just George who had made a difference that day, it was everyone. The truckers, the regulars, even herself. She felt a swell of pride as she wiped down the counter, the sense of unity stronger than ever. "We did good today," Pete said, breaking the silence. His voice was filled with admiration, not just for George, but for everyone in the diner. Lisa nodded. "Yeah, we did. It feels good knowing we can count on each other." Pete smiled. "That's what makes this place special. We're not just serving food here. We're building something that matters." Lisa couldn't agree more. The Sunburst Diner might have been just a small spot on the side of the highway, but to those who gathered there, it was a refuge, a place where people stood up for one another. It was a home, and no biker gang or threat could ever change that. As the last of the patrons paid their bills and headed out, Lisa flipped the sign on the door to closed. She stood for a moment, looking out at the now empty parking lot, her heart filled with a quiet but powerful sense of peace. Whatever challenges might come their way, she knew they could face them, together. She turned off the lights, the diner now bathed in the gentle glow of the fading sunset. With a final glance around, she whispered to herself, "We're ready." And with that, she headed to the back, ready to start again tomorrow, knowing that no matter what happened, the Sunburst Diner was more than just a place to eat. It was a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of the unbreakable strength found in standing together. Thank you for watching this story of courage and community. If you enjoyed it, please like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Let us know in the comments what you thought and where you're watching from. Together, we stand strong, just like George and his friends.